Welcome, everybody. Our guest today is Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani. Rajiv is a faculty member at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia, Canada. He is currently serving as special advisor to the provost on open education. He's also a faculty member in the Department of Psychology, so don't let the administrative position put you off him. He currently serves as an associate editor of Psychology, Learning, and Teaching, and he's an ambassador for the Center for Open Science. Rajiv previously served as an open education advisor and senior open education research and advocacy fellow with BC Campus. Many of you are familiar with BC Campus and the great work that they're doing. He also served as an OER research fellow with the Open Education Group. Finally, he was a faculty workshop facilitator with the Open Textbook Network. In short, Rajiv is very well qualified to speak to us today about OER. So with no more ado, Rajiv, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm happy that I have my Tim Hortons mug in hand as well to do some Canadian representation. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen and then activating the slides as well. So
it's working.
All righty. Is that coming through okay?
Yes. Yes, excellent.
Perfect. So again, it's thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag even after this live experience to hear from people and get their questions. But my hope was to sort of talk a bit about OER in the context of these three things: in terms of access, in terms of agency, which I think is just as important as access with openness, and of course through innovation. And really how all of these things support broad goals concerned with social justice, I think. But to start, let me just sort of make an assertion at the get-go. I really do believe that higher education is a vehicle for economic and social mobility. I think it's an incredible tool with which we can unlock human potential. But at the same time, I think the more you look at the structure of higher education itself in ways big and small, the more you see that it's actually structured in a way that replicates and in fact reinforces existing power structures. So this is something that troubles me greatly when I think about what the promise of education is and how it actually fails to deliver on that promise. And this happens in big and small ways. But it's nice to sort of, I think, remind ourselves that even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, Article 26, in fact, asserts that higher education should be accessible to all. But I think, again, with even things like this, our minds immediately go to places, let's say, in the third world. I grew up in India, for example. There's not enough seats for the number of students. There's insufficient infrastructure. But this applies in North America.
So that's not a Canadian accent we're hearing?
No, not quite. I grew up in a small town in India of about 25 million people called Bombay.
Yes.
But these data, for example, are from the US Department of Education, a study they commissioned. So just in the first decade of this century, their estimate is that 2.4 million students could not attend or complete college because of cost. And to be clear, there's a lot more students who didn't complete college or attend for other reasons. This is just the subgroup who couldn't complete because of cost. And these are kids who did all the right things. They took all the right classes, they achieved the right grades. It's literally just cost. And so I wanted to translate this into something that may be closer to home. And I admit I'm picking on Mary Washington right now, but it's really not that hard to do this with any institution right now.
Absolutely.
Cost of attendance, this is in state, by the way, just to clarify, is about 27 or so thousand just over for a year. So here's a back of napkin calculation that I think helps bring things home a little bit. Let's imagine how many hours it would take for a student at UMW working a minimum wage job to pay for 1 year of attendance, right? There's your minimum wage. And of course, there are the hours. And how does this translate into, hours per week? Well, it's kind of hard to go to school full time if that's what it costs. So again, if plan A is essentially be wealthy, I'm worried about everyone who doesn't have plan A.
Yes.
And there's literally not enough hours in the week to be able to pay your way through school. So it's not the case that it's always been this way. When I was at school, I worked. Yeah, no, it's not been like this at all. And so, of course, this is plan C. You can't work enough, so then you take on student debt. You take on student loans. And this is really quite frightening when you think about the amount of student loan debt in just the United States, which exceeds the sum total of credit card debt in your country. This is not exclusive to the US, by the way. This is a problem in Canada as well. Even though tuition is far lower over here, in places like Vancouver, the cost of living is just horrendously high. And then, of course, I like to point to implications beyond the loans itself, the financial implications of that debt. But what are we talking about in terms of the delaying of life milestones, being able to settle down, get a home, even the mental health implications? And I'm speaking now as a psychologist of that kind of financial strain. So I love sharing this image as well. This is my alma mater, the beautiful University of British Columbia. And a few years ago, they had a marketing campaign where they wanted to celebrate their graduates around convocation. And they put these posters on the ground around campus, and they gave the graduating students these markers to fill in your most memorable experience. And that's not quite what they were going for. But of course, that's precisely the image that went viral. So I'm not going to belabor this too much. I think Sarah Goldrick-Raab is an extraordinary scholar who's done a really good job of laying bare the reality of students today, particularly as it concerns the problem of food insecurity in particular. But I'm not going to talk about cost of living or tuition or transport. I'm literally going to focus on resources for a little bit. And of course, there's a few reasons for that, one of which has to do with the issue of control. Right? As faculty, we don't control tuition or the cost of living, but we do control the cost of required course resources, and we're the only people who make that choice. But it's also this, that there is no other consumer good that between 1977 and 2016 had risen in cost as much as textbooks have. And it's interesting, many of the publishers now point to the sort of plateauing of that graph over the last year and a half. And I think that's rather interesting because, of course, that includes things like book rentals, the use of OER, a number of things that are sort of conflated. But certainly it's always been consistently between 3 and 4 times the pace of inflation. So this is horrendous. We are living, in the era of the $400 textbook at this point. And for example, at my institution, this is a public teaching undergraduate institution, tuition for a single course is in fact $400. And so we have this weird situation where people can budget for and they expect tuition. But of course, you walk into the bookstore after you register and you get this horrible shock. And then of course, the collateral damage as well is in the reputation of the bookstore, which is unfairly blamed for the prices when they have little control over that either. But here's the actual implication I want to talk about. So this is a survey that's been done a couple of times in the state of Florida, Florida Virtual Campus. They did this in 2012, did this again in 2016. And what I like about this as a researcher is that their sample size is about 22,000 students.
Yeah, that's
and right, they hail from every single degree granting institution in the state, which means that the margin for error is really incredibly small. But it's been getting slowly worse. So at this point, or at least 2 years ago, roughly 2/3 of students reporting that they're not purchasing a required textbook for at least one of their courses because of cost. That's how that sentence ends in the survey. Almost half taking fewer courses or not registering for a specific section of a course or a course because of, cost. And you can see the rest of the data. Now, we've replicated this study in British Columbia. The numbers are not quite as bad, but certainly, 54% of students in British Columbia are reporting that they're not purchasing required textbooks as well. And what's interesting, again, is that when we looked at, this is a study we published last year, my wife and I, in Erodal, we found that this burden was being disproportionately borne by students who self-identify as being a member of a visible minority, who self-identify as carrying a student loan, and those who are first in their family or first-generation students as well. So it's another sort of illustration that it's not just that textbook costs are prohibitive. It's not just that they're influencing negatively educational outcomes, but that this negative impact is disproportionately borne by students who are already marginalized in various ways. And so I think for me, Aaron Swartz is a massive hero. And so I want to sort of connect back to some of the things he wrote in his Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, because I think it's pertinent over here. As educators, I think we need to think about this. He wrote, information is power, but like all power, there are those, excuse me, Adobe wants to update right now. There are those who want to keep it for themselves. He wrote that the world's entire scientific and cultural heritage, published over centuries in books and journals, is increasingly being digitized, locked up by a handful of companies, private companies. Those with access to these resources, students, librarians, scientists, in other words, you and I, we've been given a privilege. We get to feed at this banquet of knowledge while the rest of the world is locked out. But he says you need not, indeed morally you cannot, keep this privilege for yourselves. You have a duty to share it with the world. And to me, of course, he's talking about open access in a broader sense as well. But I think this applies very much to the use of open educational resources. And so at this point, I know from following the course, folks already understand quite well what OER are, and there's been discussions about the 5 R's as described by Wiley. And I think it's useful, though, to say that while reuse is incredibly important, the two that excite me the most as a faculty member are revise and remix, right? I mean, for years, we've gone through this. When I say it out loud, it sounds frankly absurd that we bend our courses to map onto the table of contents of a textbook.
Oh, there's no question about that. Yeah.
It's bizarre. It's like a bizarre normative practice.
And many times when you speak to faculty, they talk about their course as covering, they need to cover the content in the text.
Exactly.
As if the tail is wagging the dog here.
Very much so. So I think, the ability to say, don't read chapter 5, take it out. If there's something missing, add it in. If there's something that needs updating, make that change. I mean, but go further, right? Embed local examples and statistics. I mean, reflect the diversity of your classroom in the names of the examples if you can. I mean, weave your assignment through it. Highlight research from your department if you want. Just make it your own. So that for me is really exciting, because when people talk about academic freedom, I think we get really sort of hot under the collar about it. But we often sort of forget about this battleground for academic freedom that we've long conceded when it comes to the use of teaching resources. And then, of course, retain and redistribute, which again should not be underestimated. The power of a student who takes, let's say, anatomy and physiology, who wants to go on to medical school, being able to keep that book as a resource and not have to resell it because they're trying to recover some of that $400.
Yeah, or lose it when it's a rental.
No kidding.
Yeah.
One
of my sons who's in college came back and this year rented the same book again for a different course. And I said, why didn't you just buy the thing?
Yeah.
And he said he didn't know. So.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting. I mean, I see a lot of faculty who, again, it's not that they wouldn't want to, it's that they don't know about this new option, right? Because there's nobody knocking on your office door asking if they can sponsor a research meeting or sort of coming to share their new wares. There's nobody doing that for open textbooks, really, on campuses. So that's certainly a challenge. But I think we also need to rethink what we need. What I'm showing you right now is an example of an open textbook that I worked on. So you can see I'm not an unbiased spectator or observer over here. This is an open textbook that I worked on. I didn't create it. I adapted it for the Canadian context because laws governing research with human participants are different from the US to Canada. We wanted to make updates about psychology's replicability issue, talk about open science practices. So we did that. But since then, the book I worked on has been improved by Dana Layton at Texas A&M, has been improved further by Carrie Cutler at Washington State University, and improved further earlier this year by Matthew Crump at Brooklyn College. So it's beautiful to see these things sort of take a life of their own and have so many students benefit from the cumulative expertise of so many faculty. So for me, absolutely access is critical in ensuring that all of my students have immediate, permanent, cross-format access. But as a faculty member, I think what's really cool is this sort of pedagogy and the innovation and being able to look at, even though we're calling this a second Canadian edition, make updates much more swiftly. You don't have to wait 3 years. In some disciplines, you imagine sort of, introduction to French. Yeah, I don't need a new edition of that every 2 years. It's not changing. Or for that matter, we're not growing new organs for anatomy. Or I don't need a new description of classical conditioning every 2 years in psychology. And in other disciplines, think computer science, some areas of marketing, lots of areas, things move so much faster that the conventional new edition cycle is actually far too slow. So either way, it's quite interesting. Either you don't need the new edition, and it's being foisted upon you as a way of essentially killing the used textbook market, or it's far too slow.
Let me just throw in a little comment, which is in my own work in open books, open textbooks, has always started life as a digital document. And it seems like the day after you publish a book, you remember some things that you would love to have added. Mm-hmm. And in the traditional print model, you're just stuck until there's another edition. But in the digital version, you can make those changes very quickly.
Absolutely. And you can make them with your students as well, right? Mm-hmm. Think about the sort of bonus credit assignments and what students can do. That's, I'm going to get to that, but I think that's part of the excitement.
Good. Yeah.
But I do want to mention as well, this is not just one of these, feel good, wouldn't it be nice if, kumbaya moments that we can sort of save the world and we can innovate at the same time. Because, frankly, that makes me sound like I work in Silicon Valley if you put those two things in a sentence. But really, it's supported by empirical research as well. At this point, there's been about 16 studies published in peer-reviewed journals that have looked at the impact on educational outcomes of OER adoption. In fact, I probably should say 17, because a study that I worked on was just accepted last week. It's in press right now in the Canadian Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. But every one of them is essentially saying the same thing, that students assigned OER, so students who are essentially randomly assigned to sections, even if they're taught by the same instructors, but assigned OER, whereas other students, same course, same instructor even, assigned commercial textbooks. Students assigned OER are usually performing the same, and in some cases outperforming those assigned commercial resources. And I think there's many reasons for that, but I suspect the primary one is access. It's those students who wouldn't have got the book otherwise, who are waiting for their student loan before they can buy a book, who are otherwise compromising, knowingly compromising their educational potential because of cost. So again, it's not just a good idea. This is, in fact, sound. But this is the reason why I really started to get interested in this. And I talked about earlier how the burden of textbook costs is disproportionately borne by students who are already marginalized. These are comments from student evaluations the very first semester about 6 years ago that I started adopting open textbooks. Mm-hmm. And I love that comment in the middle, because that's the student I'm especially concerned about. That yes, obviously they love the cost savings, they like the flexibility, they like the sort of portability and all of that. But to hear that they wouldn't have bought the textbook because it's an elective, they would have walked away with a C, now they might get an A minus. You think about sort of curiosity-based learning. I know I fell into my major not by design, but because of an extraordinary experience in the classroom. But to me, this is a wonderful reason to continue by itself. Leave aside the sort of pedagogical innovation that we've talked about. But as I've said, for me, open education is not just about equitable access to knowledge. It is very much about equitable access to knowledge creation. And I think it's interesting to look at the era we live in now with the platforms, with the technologies. And I think it's true we live in a time where information is abundant. However, as you well know, this is also a time where misinformation is abundant, where disinformation is abundant. And so content expertise, I think, in this context becomes increasingly important, not less important. And I say that because with the proliferation of open educational resources and even online courses like MOOCs, some faculty, I think, genuinely feel threatened about their place in the classroom, their role in the world. But I think it's actually only increasing in importance in this sort of context. You look at work like Mike Caulfield's digital polarization project and the work that he's doing with his students, a form of information environmentalism where they're sort of pulling tires out of the water to try and get to the root of, trace the ideology of stories that fly through the media, for example, to verify their accuracy or lack thereof. But as we, I think, hold these values in the open education movement, and I've talked about access, and I've talked a little bit about agency in terms of faculty choice and ability to modify materials. I do think that with the best of intentions, we can and sometimes do commit harm. And that's when we ignore accessibility when we're just talking about access. I think it's critically important for us in the open ed movement to embrace principles of inclusive and universal design. It's sort of even at an open education event or conference, a speaker finishes their bit and it opens to Q&A, and maybe there's a microphone. And there's somebody in the back of the room, even though the microphone's on their way to them, who sort of yells out, "Oh, I don't need a mic, I can hear," or I'll shout. But yeah, the mic is not for you. It's for the people in the room who are hard of hearing. And that's the point. It's about how can we all benefit from taking a more inclusive approach. So I think it's critical that we don't commit harm by ignoring accessibility. I also think it's critical we don't do harm by ignoring things like digital redlining. Right? We can't just say digital, we can make things accessible, wonderful. Yes, it's true. The marginal cost of reproduction is basically zero at this point for resources. But does everyone in our classroom, all of our learners, formal and informal, do they have equitable access to the technologies to enable them to access those formats? And even if they have the technologies, you think about things like bandwidth. Is it equitable? How much are our students working? Do they have the time to perform the kinds of adaptive homework solution things that we're assigning them to do at home? So I think we do have to think much more broadly that if we want to deliver on the goals of the open education movement to make education more equitable, more accessible, that we don't ignore these critical potential pitfalls and we don't commit harm. The last one I will add, and this again concerns marginalized groups more than any other. And this comes from the writing of Amy Collier at Middlebury College, who writes about there's no such thing as the harmless collection of data or the benevolent collection of data, and how much of what we collect could and often is used in ways that we don't want it to be used to harm or imperil our students. And again, she writes, this disproportionately affects our most vulnerable students, low-income students, students of color, LGBTQ plus students, students who are immigrants. Their data are most at risk to surveillance, discrimination. Many of our vulnerable students are less likely to have experience as well with digital literacy skills. So whether you're talking about the sort of treatment of dreamers in the United States, and as we invite our students to perform open scholarship as a form of open pedagogy, mandating their digital footprint, I think behooves us to think about the implications of where those data are stored and how it may well be used against them. So again, I've said this before, I'll say it again, the opposite of open is not private. So I think it's important that we respect agency. And if you're interested, if you're like me and you're interested in open pedagogy and working with your students to produce resources that serve the commons, that are not disposable assignments, I think it's critical that we give students agency, whether that involves working within the learning management system until the work reaches a quality threshold that the student is satisfied with, not just you, whether that involves giving students the choice to perform public scholarship or not. And if they do, giving them the choice about what Creative Commons license they want to apply to their intellectual property. I think all of this is critical. It's a way of building information and digital literacy skills for sure, but it is about respecting agency. And this is why, if I have a faculty member who says, look, I've looked at the available OER, there's nothing that works for me, I'm unhappy with the quality of content in my specific subtopic, I love that faculty member because they've looked, right? They've exercised their choice. That's all I want. And for a student to say, look, this sounds fine and fun, but where I'm at, I want to perform a more traditional assignment. I think that's fine, that's excellent, and I support that. So I think agency for me is just as important as access. And so I'll finish up just by saying, I've talked about access, agency, innovation, and I think I'm hitting at some of the sort of deeper values when I talk about access and agency. But I also want to highlight what openness fosters. I think it fosters collaboration in a tremendous way. I use the example of the research methods book that I mentioned, that I was sort of number 2 in the chain, but the chain is much, much longer now. I think it certainly supports transparency. If you think about sort of open science practices, and of course, I've been referring to Virginia, and of course, the Center for Open Science is based in Virginia. If I wanted to engage in a questionable practice like hypothesizing after I already know the results,
it's easier that way,
Well, it's much easier, of course, but if I, that's harking is what we call it, right? Hypothesizing after the results are known. I can't do that if I've pre-registered my hypothesis. If I want to engage in p-hacking, where I sort of collect data and then look at the significance value, and then it's not quite there yet, let me collect a few more participants worth of data, and then I'm going to check again. That's p-hacking. You shouldn't be doing that. But if data openly in a repository, I'm caught out if I pre-register my analysis plan. If I want to support replicability in my discipline, I want to share not just my data in an open repository, but my research materials to enable that replication of my questionnaire, of my survey instrument, whatever it is, of my code. So I think all of that's critical. So transparency is big, collaboration is big, access is big, agency is big. But overall, I think for me, openness is a really critical thing, because I think education at its finest is democratizing. It is decolonized. It is I think open ultimately. And so I think I'll finish my spiel there. But hopefully we'll have quite a bit to chat about now.
Sure. Thank you, Rajiv. That was wonderful. I wrote notes as you were talking, and I have a number of questions. I'd like to push back against a lot of what you said.
Oh, good.
And here I'm representing my colleagues more than anything else. We started talking about OER and open textbooks, and you ended up talking about some much broader questions, really talking about the future of higher education, or education more generally. Okay. I can imagine colleagues saying, these are important issues, but nothing in my graduate training prepared me for these kinds of questions. Even talking about something like universal design, that's beyond my expertise level. How in the world can we expect faculty to develop expertise in all of these areas? It's as if you expect us to be learning over the course of our careers.
Oh, that you say that so sweetly with a smile on your face. So yeah, I think I'm going to push back further and say that I think when you talk about what we're trained to do versus what I'm asking you to do, I think there's already quite an interesting gulf between what we're trained to do and what we are doing now. We're never taught to teach, are we? It's a minority of graduate programs that provide any sort of teaching training. In my own graduate program, there were advisors, not mine, thankfully, but of friends of mine who explicitly went out of their way to, as they said, shelter their students from any and all teaching duties because they wanted to emphasize research. But of course, this is the future professoriate. And so we teach without training in teaching, certainly. What we're trained in, assuming we're not simply providing the same educational experience as we did in our first semester as an educator, that we're doing in the 40th semester as an educator. I think, we do have an obligation as scholars to keep abreast of developments within our discipline. And hopefully that's something that's not especially controversial. And I think that's critical if you want to provide the training that you say you're going to provide. So purely in terms of content expertise, keeping abreast of research developments, I think we're doing that already. But I think you're quite right that we don't have the training to teach. Forget talking about elements of teaching like inclusive design. So I'm not expecting that all faculty know about this, but I do expect that what drew us to the teaching profession It's surely not a desire for money. We're in the wrong profession for that.
Oh.
That what, the values that drew us into this line of work, this line of service, I would add, are values that are very consonant with some of the issues I've raised. And so I think just as we are often motivated to, I'm going to look for that workshop from my Center of Teaching and Learning. I've heard about universal design. I can understand, I've read enough about it, or a brief description to understand what it might be, that yes, this is where we need to invest some energy. Because if we want to, I think, attain the goals that we've set for ourselves, there are some real barriers to doing so. And some of these are barriers that we can quite easily overcome with just a little bit of investment of time. But I do agree, institutions absolutely need to step up to the table to provide those opportunities for their faculty, to support them, and not just in a way that that says, well, you can do this on your own time, that values it and rewards it. Yeah.
And that raises another interesting question. One could argue that the reward structures, the incentive structures, at least at U.S. universities, aren't well aligned with what you're proposing. Or to put it another way, people can get promoted regardless of the quality of their teaching. The assumption is if you're in the classroom, then you must be a good teacher. So it sounds like, one of the necessities here to get us where we want to go is to change the reward system so that what we say we value is reflected in those rewards.
I quite agree. I think it is important to align the incentive structures, but also provide structural support. So, for example, 5 years ago, I don't think there were any OER librarians. Now there's many of them. That's becoming commonplace. A position like mine probably doesn't exist at most institutions, but it will. UBC, the University of British Columbia, I mentioned it earlier, 2 years ago, revised their tenure and promotion policies so that the creation and adaptation of OER specifically is now recognized for tenure and promotion under the educational leadership stream, I think it is.
That's great.
So I don't think they're going to be the last, but I think I agree. Currently, the way things operate, especially at the sort of research-intensive institutions, and I'm going to make that distinction because I think community colleges have been leading the way with OER adoption.
Yep. There is another gulf which is less extreme than the one we've just been talking about, and you alluded to this earlier. There are different ways that one can engage with the open movement. At the lowest level, the easiest level, is one could adopt an open textbook. Okay, and that's pretty painless. Okay, you talked about the advantages of modifying the book to meet the needs of your particular context, your students, and that's wonderful. But the problem is, I've had a number of faculty members say, who has the time for that? That's a major undertaking. We're already overworked as it is. So what would you say to faculty who respond that way and to administrations who want to make an improvement?
Yeah, I'd say three things. First of all, I think we're approaching a new problem with a conventional solution in our minds already, and I think that's part of the problem. But first, I will say, if you're talking about the easiest way to engage being adoption, I think there's even easier ways to engage. Even if you simply look at a website like the Open Textbook Library, which has 450 odd open textbooks right now, you look through that and you say, I want to see if any of these books are suitable for adoption. And let's say you decide I'm not going to adopt it, but you've reviewed the book en route to that decision. Simply writing that review and sharing it publicly. So it's in a sense, it's work that's pre-adoption work.
But how would one share it?
Well, the Open Textbook Library invites that, and they have a rubric with sort of 10 criteria.
And where is that?
The University of Minnesota hosts the Open Textbook
wonderful.
Library.
Yeah.
So yeah, even if you Google Open Textbook Library, it'll pop right up, and you'll see it's transparently done. Once again, names and institutional affiliations with reviews, and they can be as long as short as you like. But this is not a movement that's about let's gloss over poor resources. No, like if you find something and you say this is terrible, tell us why it's terrible. Tell the world, shout it out from the rooftops, so that it saves other faculty from having to adopt that book, so that it tells funders who will fund the adaptation and improvement of that book where you see the problems with the book. So that'd be the easiest. But adapting is something that I think most often I see faculty adopting a book for, let's say, 1 or 2 semesters. And in the course of adopting a book, you're sort of taking notes in the margins, thinking, you know what, I want to change this thing. I want to change this example. I can think of a more recent example for this psychological phenomenon. Or, I can see this statistic needs updating from the BLS. This is now 2 years old, unemployment rates or whatever it is, right?
You're speaking my language.
Yeah. So, but again, conventional solution would be, I am a faculty member. I need to take the time. I guess that's the voice I put on. But I'm a faculty member and I need the time to do this myself. But no, you don't. So I'm thinking of faculty members in economics, in fact, who if the book is something where the core theory is essentially unchanged, but the statistics, the examples need updating, well, tweak your course assignment. What if the student's assignment is to go into the BLS, update the chart? So recreate the graphs based on this year's statistics. At the end of every semester, you republish the book with students as contributors. This is a form of research for them, integration, sort of experience with statistics, with creating charts. But it's a wonderful way of them seeing the relevance of their work actually being seen by more than by one person, and of curating the book. So I think open pedagogy is a path that we can take.
One thing that comes into my mind is OpenStax starting an open library for their various books. So if you did add a new case or something like that, OpenStax would be a place to put it so that not just you could use it, but anyone could use it.
And there's brilliant people like Billy Meinke at the University of Hawaii at Manoa who's working on solutions like this as well, so that if there's a central book and there's 10 faculty, let's say, who've created their own derivative version of the book by making small modifications, that there's a way of actually drawing all of those changes back and aggregating them automatically.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I think all of this is coming, right? But I think if you want to go, as many people have said, quickly, you may want to go alone. But if we want to go far, and I think that's the goal in the open ed movement, we go together. So I think the idea over here is fostering collaborations, especially within disciplines and across institutions. And as someone who's trying to support open adoption at my institution, I often have, let's say, 1 or 2 faculty in a department of 12 even, who are interested in this work. But they can't do it by themselves. But if I can connect them to faculty in the same department at 4 other institutions, collaboratively develop it, yes, because then it's peer review and it's more rigorous even, but you're also amplifying the impact, the reuse potential of the resource, and creating a community that will now share resources and sort of collaboratively update it.
It seems to me that part of the culture across academia is competition. Mm-hmm. Okay. And yet the open culture is very different than that. Sherry raises an interesting point. She says, what strikes me is that it seems like the professional ego needs to be set aside in order for OER to work well. Mm-hmm. I agree, but I think we're already there in my experience. People who are working in the open area are more than happy to help other people because we all see this as a collaborative exercise that each of us can contribute to making something better for all of us, far better than just each of us working on our own and reinventing the wheel again.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think Sherry's hitting on something that's quite accurate. But I, maybe just to broaden that a little bit. I think forget about open stuff. You think about peer review of teaching even. We know when this is happening. We know in advance when a colleague is going to come to our classroom as part of a formal teaching evaluation process every few years, let's say. And we prepare for that class differently because I don't think we're comfortable with people just popping in unannounced any day of the semester into our classes. Whether that's because we're afraid of being found out, whether that's because we're afraid our secret sauce will be stolen somehow. I think there's reams of fears over here. At the same time, I will say, I don't think we need to leave it to just those who have essentially overcome that barrier, that psychological barrier, to participate. I think there are wonderfully selfish reasons to engage in open if you want to, not the least of which is the open access citation advantage. If you want to be a widely read, widely cited scholar, there's no quicker path to doing that than publishing open access. I mean, it's just incredible. It's about at least 4 times the citation advantage. So at the get-go, I would say you could do that. There are institutions, I think, that look at this differently. In my backyard, again, UBC is an interesting case where I don't think they're doing a whole lot of adoption of OER, but they are doing quite a bit of creation. And so there are lots of schools that sort of see this as an opportunity, especially for flagship programs, to get their brand out there, to sort of share their expertise. Because, of course, we couldn't possibly reuse what's been created elsewhere. We're far too exalted for that. So I think it's funny, but I think you can sort of twist it either way. There are lots of faculty, I think, who care deeply about social justice. And I think that's wonderful. And that's often one of the motivations. But this is not just a movement that's sort of left-leaning. There are lots of right-leaning faculty members, administrators even, who, when you simply look at the fiscal efficiency of OER, are immediately drawn to that as well. So I think, it is flexible in terms of its entry points. I wouldn't want to say you have to be this wonderful beacon of humanity and set aside your ego to participate in open.
But do you think that an individual faculty member can really make a difference, a significant difference, by adopting an open textbook? Is that really going to help? We're not, it seems like this is a massive problem. What can one person do?
It's true. It is a massive problem. But I think, what's fun is when we have workshops sometimes, and my librarians sometimes run workshops about Pressbooks training, things like that. Maybe 4 people will show up, right? And that can feel also, even at that level, the amount of work you've put in, disappointing, you feel a bit dejected. But if you have 4 people in a workshop, those 4 people teach 8 courses at my university?
Yep.
32 courses at that point. So we're talking about hundreds, thousands of students who were indirectly influenced by that workshop. So I would say, for one, we as faculty do not understand enough the impact of exorbitant textbook costs. If you ask your students, you will be able to bridge a little bit of that principal-agent problem where you're making the choice about the resource, but you're not paying for the resource. About 35% of faculty, according to the best surveys we have, don't even know the precise cost of the textbooks they've assigned. So I think as an individual faculty member, I would say never underestimate the impact of that. At my institution, we've just launched what we call Z-Cred, or what Americans pronounce as Z degrees. And, 10 courses, average textbook cost. What's that?
I understood. I speak British.
Oh, there we go. But, you think about 10 courses in the course of a year of study, even if you take more than a year to do it, that's the equivalent of giving every student at least $1,000 scholarship, or the equivalent of asking them to work at least 3 fewer hours per week for the entire academic year. So do not underestimate that impact. So I would say significant, highly significant cost savings to students are, in some sense, the least significant impact of open, but one that I think we should never underestimate. So as a faculty member, I think even if you take from this that, all right, this is something I wish I could do, and I've looked in the open textbook library and I haven't found anything, or I found something and I didn't like it, fine. Take this instead. Go and use your power.
Lost him. He's frozen.
The price dropped from $200 to about $120.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you manage to negotiate a better price for your students, I'll count that as a win. Even if you look for ways to empower your students via open pedagogy, I'll count that as a win. And if you look at resources and decide it's not for you, I'll count that as a win, because you are now in the minority of faculty who know about OER and have cared enough to actually look. So, I think as much as you want to wade into this water, it's easy to go in very slightly. But certainly for people like you, Steve, and myself, I think we've seen the impact, we've felt the impact on our students, but also, frankly, on our own professional experience and what it means to be an educator. I think that's why any conversation about open education resources or textbooks very quickly for me becomes a conversation about teaching philosophy and what you see your role is as a teaching faculty in the classroom.
Here's a question. Let's see. A question from Amy. Do you see that?
Oh, Amy. Hey. Yes. So I'm just trying to sort of follow all the hi, Amy shout outs. Yes. So this is a statement about, managing a OER primary source repository for Soviet history, 15,000 users at the peak of the semester. That's amazing. But it sort of, to me, echoes what's happening in many other pockets as well. So one lovely example, and thanks for sharing the link, is the LibreTexts initiative, right? So Delmar Larsen and his colleagues at UC Davis began what was originally ChemWiki, so a wiki project written by students, in fact, for chemistry, which you talk about 15,000. That website is the most visited chemistry website in the world. So I love that this happens, right, in terms of impact. And as an open textbook author, it is fun to see not just how many people are accessing your resource, but also where in the world they are accessing it. And it's terrific to see that. I would expect that it's not just the number of users, but the geographic distribution would be quite stunning for that resource.
I have a slightly different approach, Rajiv. When I was a new faculty member, my goal was to change the world. I've lowered that bar a little bit. My approach now is that if I can help one student graduate who otherwise wouldn't because of the textbook that I adopted, then I count that as a victory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, but it will be far more than that one student, and it's the students who I think are least equipped to deal with these issues. So even things like, when I talk about first gen students early on, one of the problems with that is that if you are a first gen student, you don't necessarily have the sort of passed down knowledge about how to navigate in legal and illegal ways exorbitant textbook costs. So you do go to the bookstore and you buy the brand new hardcover books because for your first year, because that's what your syllabus says. You don't realize that there are all of these other options. Or perhaps you make the choice not to. So I think it is key that we attune ourselves to this, that we don't keep structuring our classrooms in a way that requires students to know this stuff or to be wealthy enough to navigate it. Just looking at the comments over here again. Amy's talking also, I think it's Amy anyway, I'm getting sort of okay, of alphabets, but how they use a textbook, essentially that costs $20, can be used for more than one course. I think this is another lovely thing to point out, because there are choices that faculty make right now that reflect the same concern, but they were made from a place that also isn't unaware of the availability of OER. So for example, Introduction to Psychology in the US is typically a one-semester course, but in Canada it's a two-semester course. And they're two separate courses, but you can take them one after the other, of course, directly. And we make the choice to standardize a commercial textbook very often in our departments, so that if a student takes one with one faculty member and they go on to take the second half with another faculty member, they shouldn't have to buy another book. Right? So that's a decision to adopt the commercial book, but standardizing that adoption in order to save students money.
Sure.
And so it's interesting. So the motivation is there. And it's just the option didn't exist, or the awareness wouldn't exist that OpenStack psychology exists, NOBA psychology exists, BC Campus psychology exists. So I think it's a way of sort of introducing it, but tapping into the values that people already hold. Because I think that's exactly why we're in this space, is because we have values that are very much in alignment with the open education movements. I think Amy's also talking about how she talks to students about why we buy that textbook and the quality of the scholarship, point out the same scholars have contributed to the OER. Absolutely. And I think this goes back again to the point we were making earlier about agency. And I think there's no better person to make the choice about resource. There's nobody else who should make that choice than a faculty member. And so I have no problem with that at all. It's the awareness piece, and it's the exercising of informed choice that I'm really sort of pushing for in this space. Now, along the way, we're going to reinvigorate some pedagogy. Along the way, we're going to help a whole lot of students in ways that we could never anticipate. And I see on the Open Learning website, there's a link to, looks like a video from a student panel. And if you haven't seen that already, I would pop in there. Anytime you have a chance to speak with students directly and learn about the impact, how much it matters to them. I can tell you that the physics faculty member at UBC who adopted an OpenStax textbook, walked into their classroom, big 400 student lecture theater, and received a standing ovation from those students on the first day of the semester because of those textbook savings, that instructor is never going to forget that experience. And of course, that's the experience that I think we can all taste.
And on that note, I think we will close. I don't think there's anything more that can be said. Thank you, Rajiv. We really appreciate you speaking to us today. If you want to hang on the line for a few minutes, you and I can talk. And for the rest of you, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for having me.
You bet.